The outbreak of the virus has worsened due to the increase of massive number of cases daily. As deadly as it seems, it poses threats in various aspects concerning the state, not just the disruptions in the livelihood of the people. The right question to ask here is, how severe is the COVID-19? Up to January 2021, the virus has claimed the lives of almost 2 million people globally. The initial inference is that the virus is not able to be transmitted from one human to another. Therefore, the world is not armed with the idea that it is fatal and infectious. From false inference to deaths and suffering, the impact of the coronavirus is not something that can be reversed in months. It may take years or even a lifetime. Hence, it is crucial to identify the impacts of the pandemic in order to design and be equipped with suitable strategies to tackle this issue. Likewise, it is also important to explore ways a state could protect itself from the implications of the pandemic. The state experienced threats in terms of its national security, economic security, and political security. The pandemic poses impacts towards national security in terms of its geopolitics. The pandemic has increased the competition between nations, especially between the United States and China. For example, in the case of Huawei and United States government. Next, the pandemic also poses threats to the future of the European Union and risk of attacks both biologically and virtually. This condition, if it is not improved, will likely to move towards the styles of Cold War when states are in competition with one another. For example, the US and China are moving towards Cold War when the two superpowers face economic interdependence that is difficult to untangle. That would suggest that both sides ample incentives for reconciliation. On the other hand, the impact of the pandemic has led to critical supply chains. Government and many private firms alike encountered three large interrelated risks to their critical supply chains and to their material readiness for health emergencies.
Next, we move on to the impacts that the COVID-19 can cause to the economic security. So basically, economic security is the ability of individual, household, or communities to cover their essentials sustainably and with dignity. Economic security is very important as it strengthens tolerance and happiness as well as growth and development. There are many impacts of COVID-19 towards economic security. Firstly, it can increase the poverty threshold. COVID-19 has put an increase in number of poverty in the world. A research shows that the global poverty is expected to increase in 2020 due to this pandemic, and that really scares us. Secondly, it can also lead to an unemployment. COVID-19 has caused the unemployment rate to increase in the world. Many people lost their jobs due to this pandemic, and the unemployment rate were expected to increase until COVID-19 gone away. And lastly, COVID-19 also can put effects the gross domestic products (GDP) of the nations. GDP was a baseline to measure the economy of particular nations. Without economy, a country cannot develop itself due to no flow in the market.
In terms of the state's political security, the pandemic poses a number of political threats. Firstly, there is an impact towards international relations. The relation between states is jeopardized by the virus when states in the international system were not able to stand on firm grounds. For example, the pandemic has politically caused tension for both Japan and South Korea when South Korea restricts entry for travelers from Japan. As the two countries are closely related, this causes tension when economic activities were put to a halt due to the pandemic. Secondly, the pandemic may enable more groups with the interest of cope d'etat to overthrow the government. This may happen when the government loses its credibility in controlling the massive spread of the virus. This may result in protests towards the government and the government policies if legislations are not carefully implemented. Lastly, politically, it poses a risk of terrorism, both domestic and international. There is no doubt that global ceasefire issued by the United Nations has silenced terrorism globally. However, the key here is to identify what factors exist internally that may harm the state. For example, recently, the Trump presidency met its end and it has caused the supporters of the Republicans to revolt towards the government as a way to oppose the result of the 2020 United States presidential elections. The state should implement measures to protect itself from the social, economic, and political aspects.
So how can a state protecting itself from COVID-19 in terms of social aspects? Basically, there have been social changes due to COVID-19. This COVID-19 has had far-reaching consequences beyond the spread of the disease itself, in which it affected the social, making many people died to this pandemic. As for the solutions, a state can implement the legislations, which includes border restrictions and implementations of lockdown. Border restrictions was imposed by many countries and regions in order for them to prevent citizens and travelers from entering and traveling overseas. Whereas implementations of lockdown by the government, for example in Malaysia, has caused people to stay at home. The state also can find ways to fight the virus. These ways includes the joint research and development of vaccines. For example, every nation has done a research on vaccines to fight the virus. Medical experts as well as pharmaceutical company has joined research to develop the vaccines, and this is important. With that ways we can finally find a cure to this pandemic. Economic is a social science concerned with the productions, distributions, and consumptions of goods and services. It studies how individual businesses, governments, and nations make choices about how to allocate resources. A state can protect itself from economic aspects by introducing economic recovery plan. The pandemic has caused the largest global recessions in history, and thus each country should find their way to recover back the economy. For example, Malaysia introduced short-term economic recovery plan, which includes various tax incentives and tax exemptions introduced to corporations as well as individuals. Next, a state also can give the people aid in terms of giving them money during COVID-19. Many people suffered a lot because COVID-19, and they even lost their jobs due to this pandemic. Government should help its people by providing aid, and this can to some extent relieve the burden that they had to carry. For example, household individuals were given incentive one-off money. This can be seen on the incentive that was implemented by the Malaysian government. And economic is very important to maintain the sustainability of a country, as it helps to develop a country.
It is vital to protect the state politically. As the number of casualties rises, people are starting to question the effectiveness of the safety precautions implemented by the government. Therefore, this may possibly affect the state politically when people do not believe in the government anymore. Extreme measures may be taken by the people to protest against the government. The first way to secure the state politically is by imposing the state of emergency. The significance of this is that it is meant to tackle political impacts of the coronavirus pandemic, to prevent coup d'etat, to secure political positions in addition to stopping chaos. This is because the state of emergency is seen as a medium that could effectively implement measures that are best in curbing the virus. As an example, the Yang di-Pertuan Agong of Malaysia, in particular the King, imposed the state of emergency in Malaysia from January 11 to August 31st. However, the imposition of such state of emergency differs from those imposed before, where the difference is the goal is to control the spread of the virus. Thus, there is no elections, no curfew, and no parliamentary state assembly. On the other hand, the civilian government and cabinet continue to run as usual, as well as economic activities. The King may implement any legislations that is necessary without consulting the Parliament during this period. In conjunction, in order to protect the states, a global ceasefire is to be implemented. This is done in order to ensure the silencing of guns create opportunities for life-saving aids, open more windows for diplomacy, in addition to bringing hope to those who are badly affected by the pandemic. For example, the United Nations Secretary-General in late March 2020 issued an urgent global ceasefire. The trends are surprising as people are united to fight the infectious virus. It is also noted that the coronavirus has silenced terrorism globally.
In conclusion, COVID-19 poses threat that is not only affecting the livelihood of people but also the state. As the number of casualties and economic fallout increases, it is important to understand the need of implementing proper legislations that could minimize the impact of the pandemic. The pandemic should never put a stop to the effort to counter the impacts of this pandemic.